The heat radiated off the Texas asphalt in shimmering waves, blurring the line between sky and ground. It was mid-afternoon at Fort Hood, and the air on the flight line felt heavy enough to choke. The smell of fuel and gun oil lingered everywhere, carried by the faint thrum of helicopters idling in the distance. Specialist Maria Delgado squinted against the glare as she adjusted her Kevlar gloves and leaned into the crate of 30mm rounds. The ammunition wasn't light, each belt a metallic snake, dull brass glinting when the sun hit just right. Sweat rolled down her neck, soaking the collar of her uniform, but she kept her rhythm steady. Bend, lift, load. Bend, lift, load. This was the kind of work nobody noticed until it wasn't done right. The kind of task that required quiet precision, but offered no glory. For Maria, that was exactly the point. She didn't crave recognition. She preferred the anonymity of ordnance duty, a blending into the endless rows of soldiers who fueled the Army's machines. The A-64 Apache sat before her like a beast at rest, its rotors stilled, its frame looming against the horizon. She'd always thought the Apache carried a kind of menace, even while grounded. Everything about it seemed designed to intimidate, from the long, insect-like nose to the stub wings bristling with pylons. Some soldiers treated the gunship with reverence, almost as if it were alive. For Maria, it was just another machine, a machine that demanded to be fed. She slid another belt of rounds into place. The metallic clatter echoed across the flight line, blending with the distant bark of a drill sergeant and the laughter of younger soldiers. Most ignored her, too focused on their own duties. That was fine. That was how she wanted it. But one pair of eyes was fixed on her. Captain James Riley leaned against the Apache's ladder, helmet tucked under his arm, watching as Maria worked. He was supposed to be reviewing a flight checklist, but his attention had drifted. Something about the ordnance specialist caught him off guard, not in the way of distraction or attraction, but in the sense that something about her didn't fit. He'd seen her before, countless times, moving across the hangar, always quiet, always efficient. She never lingered in groups, never joined the chatter that filled the barracks. She carried herself like someone who knew how to disappear. Most of the time, James barely noticed her. But today was different. She bent low to lift another crate, sleeves pushed back in the heat. That was when he saw it. Ink. At first, it was nothing unusual. Plenty of soldiers had tattoos, eagles, flags, mottos, even poorly done symbols from back home. But this one stopped him cold. It was simple, faint from age, but unmistakable. A black emblem, sharp lines forming an angular shape, a shadow that didn't belong in daylight. James's chest tightened. He knew that symbol, knew it well enough to feel his pulse spike in his throat. He blinked, wondering if fatigue had tricked his eyes. But when she straightened, the sleeve of her uniform still shifted just enough for the tattoo to show. It wasn't a random design. It wasn't a mistake. It was Nightshade, a unit that didn't officially exist. James froze, his checklist forgotten. The sounds of the flight line dulled around him. For years, he had buried that emblem in his memory, along with everything it represented, the missions cloaked in silence, the orders given. With no record, the faces of men who disappeared without explanation. And now, here it was again, on the arm of a woman loading his Apache's rounds. Maria felt the weight of his stare. She looked up, eyes meeting his across the shadow of the gunship. For the briefest second, her expression faltered. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, almost casually, she tugged her sleeve down, covering the mark. Her movements returned to their rhythm. Bend, lift, load, as if nothing had happened. But James couldn't unsee it. He tried to steady his breathing. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just a similar design. But deep down, he knew better. That tattoo wasn't common ink. You didn't stumble into it. You earned it, or, more truthfully, survived it. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. James opened his mouth, then shut it again. What would he even say? I know what you are. I know where you've been. That wasn't a conversation you had on an open flight line with curious ears nearby. Maria avoided his gaze now, focusing hard on her task. But her body language betrayed her. Her shoulders stiffened, her movements just a fraction too precise. She knew he'd seen, and she knew that he knew. James finally forced himself to glance away, pretending to study his checklist again. But his thoughts raced faster than any rotor blade. How could she be here? Nightshade wasn't something you walked away from. It wasn't something you spoke about ever. Those who carried the emblem carried ghosts, debts, and secrets too dangerous for daylight. He looked back once more, almost against his will. Maria Delgado, the quiet ordnance loader, who seemed invisible to everyone else, was suddenly the most visible person in his world, and she was staring right back at him. Neither spoke. Neither moved. But the silence between them was louder than any engine. The moment had passed, but the imprint of it lingered in James Riley's mind. He couldn't shake the image of Maria Delgado's sleeve sliding back, revealing that unmistakable mark. Nightshade. The name alone brought a flood of memories he had spent years trying to bury. Shadows of missions erased from every record, faces of comrades who never returned, orders whispered across desert sands that never appeared in reports. He had tried to forget, to compartmentalize that part of himself, but seeing her tattoo made it impossible. He remembered the first time he saw it in the field. A young soldier, barely older than Maria, had carried it with pride and terror in equal measure. That emblem had been both shield and curse, a sign of belonging to something secret, something dangerous. Nightshade was the kind of unit that didn't exist in manuals or personnel files. The missions weren't real. The soldiers weren't real. The failures weren't recorded. And yet, every detail had burned itself into him. He glanced again at Maria as she lifted another ammo box, her muscles rippling under the sweat-soaked fabric. Her movements were smooth, disciplined, professional, perfectly ordinary. Yet the tattoo under her sleeve was anything but ordinary. James swallowed. Could it really be her? Could she have survived what he had survived? Could someone else bear that emblem after everything Nightshade had demanded? Maria had noticed his stare moments before. She had seen recognition flicker in his eyes. That brief pause, the way he froze, he knew. But did he know the full story? She tugged her sleeve down quickly, the motion seamless, professional, betraying nothing. Her hands returned to the rounds, as if the moment had never happened. Her heart, however, was beating like a drum inside her chest. For years, Maria had hidden the tattoo. She had survived dangerous missions, vanished from official records, and returned home to civilian life as much as one could after Nightshade. She had trained herself to blend in, to move unnoticed, to carry her past silently beneath sleeves and uniforms. But some secrets refused to stay buried, and James Riley's eyes had just dug them up. She remembered the day she earned it. She had been barely 19, deployed into a desert storm, her squad tasked with reconnaissance in enemy territory. Orders came through encrypted channels, impossible to trace, impossible to verify. The emblem had been burned into her forearm, in a field hospital with ink that wouldn't fade under harsh conditions. It was a mark of survival, of belonging to a unit that existed in whispers, shadows, and classified folders. It was both badge and burden. James's chest tightened as he remembered those same missions. The smoke, the dust, the distant hum of helicopters over villages, that no one would ever know about. He had lost friends. He had done things that haunted him every night. And now, here she was alive, standing before him, carrying the same symbol of survival. He could hardly believe it. He studied her face carefully. Maria Delgado had always been quiet, efficient, almost invisible. Yet something about the weight behind her eyes hinted at untold stories. The tattoo was proof enough that she had lived through horrors that left scars invisible to the naked eye. It was proof of resilience, but also of shared guilt. The kind of guilt that lingered even decades later, like a shadow that never left. As she shifted another box of rounds into place, James's mind raced. Could he trust her? Could she trust him? And what would happen if anyone else noticed the emblem? If someone connected the dots? Nightshade didn't exist officially, but its legacy had teeth. Soldiers who had survived often carried a price watchful eyes, suspicion, sometimes even attempts to erase them permanently. And now, both of them were standing on the same flight line, unaware of how long that price would hang over them. Maria, meanwhile, felt her pulse accelerating. She wasn't afraid of James. He wouldn't harm her. But recognition carried danger. Knowledge was dangerous. The tattoo was her secret armor and her liability, a memory etched into her skin and soul. She knew James understood some of it. Their silence was loaded. Taut with the weight of shared experience, neither dared speak aloud. Her mind wandered briefly to the operations she had survived. Nights under fire, patrols where every step could mean death, missions so secret, even her family wouldn't know where she had been. The emblem had been a promise of loyalty, a reminder of those who had fallen beside her, a signal to others in the same unit. Yet here it was, exposed to someone who could potentially see her for who she truly was. Someone who might recognize the same weight she carried every day. James finally cleared his throat, breaking the tension. But the words didn't come easily. Instead, he took a step back, pretending to check his checklist. Inside, he was calculating, remembering, trying to place her in a timeline of operations that no one on base should even know existed. How could she have survived? How had she been reassigned here without triggering alarms? And why had she disappeared from official channels, just like everyone else in Nightshade? Maria continued her work, but her mind was alert. She felt the tension radiating from him, but she didn't panic. Years of operating in silence had trained her well. She understood unspoken cues, the way recognition traveled without words. The eyes of someone who knew were dangerous and comforting, in a way she couldn't explain. The flight line felt suddenly smaller, more intimate. Helicopters hummed, engines throbbed, soldiers shouted orders, but to Maria and James, the world had narrowed to this single taut moment. The tattoo, the emblem, the recognition, it was a pivot point. A moment when the past collided with the present. Finally, James allowed himself to speak, but only in fragments. He began, then paused, shaking his head. The words sounded absurd, forced. I've seen that before, years ago. He gestured vaguely, trying not to draw attention from nearby soldiers. Where did you? He stopped, realizing any more questions would betray knowledge of classified operations. He swallowed, forcing his voice back into a neutral tone. Maria didn't respond verbally. Her hands moved automatically, loading rounds as if the conversation hadn't begun. But her eyes flicked to him. The barest tilt of her head conveyed acknowledgement. She didn't need to speak. They both knew. James's pulse slowed fractionally, but the tension didn't leave. Nightshade wasn't just a memory. It was a thread running through both their lives, a connection stronger than any words could convey. He remembered comrades lost, missions that never existed on paper, the unending secrecy that shaped him. And here, in the middle of a sun-baked Texas flight line, the emblem had returned to remind him that the past never stayed buried. Maria exhaled softly, steadying herself. She had prepared for years to hide, to vanish into the background, to be just another soldier in the line. But now, the tattoo had revealed her, not to enemies, but to someone who had walked the same shadowed path. She was cautious, yet not afraid. James wasn't a threat. He was a mirror, reflecting her own history back at her, forcing her to reckon with the memories she had tried to leave behind. The rest of the flight line seemed oblivious to their silent exchange. Soldiers passed, engines whined, helicopters rotated, but for Maria and James, the world had condensed into a single point of understanding. And in that point, there was danger and comfort intertwined. They both knew the emblem was not just a symbol. It was a story, a warning, a memory, and now it was alive again. Neither spoke again for the next few minutes. Maria finished her, loading, sliding the final rounds into the Apache's belly with mechanical precision. James stepped back, pretending to check instruments and flight logs. But their eyes met fleetingly over the Apache's fuselage, each glance carrying volumes they couldn't say aloud. Finally, Maria straightened and wiped sweat from her brow. She moved as if nothing had happened, returning the empty crate to its storage rack. James exhaled, knowing the moment had passed for now, but the impact would linger. Nightshade wasn't a unit that faded easily, and neither were the soldiers who had survived it. For the first time in years, James felt the weight of recognition and the echo of past missions stir inside him. The tattoo was more than ink. It was a call, a reminder, a link to a past that refused to die. And Maria Delgado, quietly loading the Apache's rounds, was living proof of it. The sun was beginning its slow descent over Fort Hood, casting long shadows across the asphalt of the flight line. The heat of the day lingered, baking the metal of helicopters and crates alike. Maria Delgado moved with practiced efficiency, her hands steadying despite the nerves thudding behind her ribcage. Each 30 millimeters round she loaded into the Apache's belly felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its weight, but because of the silent scrutiny she sensed from across the aircraft. Captain James Riley lingered nearby, ostensibly checking flight logs and instrument panels, but his gaze was fixed. He couldn't look away. The tattoo on Maria's forearm, glimpsed earlier in the day, burned in his memory, refusing to be dismissed. Nightshade, the emblem etched into her skin, was a mark he had hoped he would never see again. The same symbol he had carried, and the same he had once seen, inked onto the arms of soldiers who had vanished without a trace. He tried to look elsewhere, focusing on checklists, pretending to adjust instruments, but his eyes betrayed him. The memory it triggered was unavoidable. Sand-choked villages, whispered commands over secure radios, the constant hum of helicopters that were both sanctuary and predator. He had survived things no one was supposed to survive. And yet, here she was alive, efficient, and carrying the mark of the same ghosted unit. Maria noticed his glances. She had trained herself to handle scrutiny, to operate under observation, but there was something different in James's eyes. It wasn't curiosity, or even casual interest. It was recognition, not just of her skill or her presence, but of the unspoken, shadowed past that both of them carried. The pulse of shared history throbbed between them, silent, undeniable. Bend, lift, load. Her movements remained fluid, precise, but internally her mind raced. She had survived Nightshade, survived the missions erased from official records, and returned home with the weight of the emblem pressed into her flesh. She had spent years learning to hide that weight, to appear ordinary, to vanish among the mundane tasks of daily military life. And now James Riley had unearthed it with nothing more than a glance. He shifted slightly, breaking the tension, but the pull of familiarity was too strong. James remembered his own first days in Nightshade. Young, eager, terrified, thrust into operations that had no paperwork, no oversight, no safety net. The emblem was not merely decorative. It was a pledge, a bond, and a reminder that the world beyond their missions did not recognize their existence. Recognition was dangerous. And yet, standing here, observing Maria, James felt an odd sense of relief. She was proof that some of them had survived. Proof that the past could sometimes reach forward into the present without destroying them. For Maria, the weight of recognition pressed against her chest. She had encountered plenty of curious eyes in her time supervisors, colleagues, strangers who might wonder about her quiet efficiency, but none had ever known what the emblem truly meant. This one had. The tattoo was not a conversation starter. It was a story she couldn't tell aloud, one that had claimed too many lives to risk discussing in daylight. And yet, she knew James understood. They were both survivors of missions erased from memory. And in that understanding, a connection sparked unspoken, but tangible. She finished loading the last belt of rounds and stepped back. Her breathing was steady, professional, but her mind replayed the moment the tattoo was seen. Would he ask? Would he accuse? Or would he simply understand, as she knew he could? She turned slightly, pretending to adjust a crate, and caught his eyes. There was no accusation, no surprise, only a mirrored understanding of burdens neither of them could fully articulate. James exhaled, though subtly. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a relief buried beneath layers of vigilance and habit. He had seen the emblem before. He had understood it before. And yet, seeing it again, so unexpectedly, brought the past rushing back. The missions erased from the books, the soldiers who vanished without ceremony, the orders given and forgotten. Everything came alive again, crystallized in the arc of her sleeve. Memory washed over him. He saw the first mission in vivid detail, the sun blistering over a desert outpost, the chatter of secure radios, the constant hum of Apache rotors overhead. They had been young then, expendable, trusted with secrets that no one could know. They had earned the emblem under fire, in moments that had tested every moral and physical limit. Every mark on the skin was a badge of survival and a scar on the soul. And now, Maria carried it across the flight line as if it were ordinary. Lieutenant Riley, a junior soldier, called out from a nearby corner of the hangar, breaking the momentary trance. James shifted slightly, forcing his gaze to the present. "Everything all right with the Apache?" "Yeah," he replied, voice steady, measured. "Nothing more. No one else needed to know. They never did. Not about Nightshade. Not about the past that clawed into the present in the form of faded ink." Maria nodded silently, not looking up, keeping her posture professional. She understood that any acknowledgement of their shared history had to remain wordless. Words would betray them. Their silence, however, carried the depth of decades of experiences compressed into a single moment. The sun dipped lower, painting the flight line in shades of gold and orange. Shadows stretched across the ground, creating patterns that reminded James of nights spent lying prone in deserts, observing, waiting, surviving. Each movement of Maria's hands was mirrored in memory. The way she handled ammunition, the subtle flex of her fingers, the careful calibration of effort. Even in mundane repetition, there was a discipline born of battlefield necessity. He felt an urge to speak, to reach across the gulf of years and shared experiences, but the words caught in his throat. There were some things you could not voice, some memories too dangerous to revive aloud. The emblem itself spoke volumes more than any conversation could. Maria adjusted her gloves, brushed a lock of hair from her face, and carried another crate to the Apache's storage area. She moved with a quiet confidence that betrayed nothing of her inner tension. Yet the rhythm of her movements reflected years of training under conditions most soldiers could not fathom. James watched, realizing that efficiency in her case was a survival mechanism as much as a professional necessity. In the quiet between the whirring of rotors and distant voices, James found himself replaying details he hadn't considered in years. The Nightshade missions had demanded absolute discretion, brutal efficiency, and the constant suppression of moral questions. They had carried the emblem like a badge and a curse. And now, that emblem was alive again, in the flesh, on someone who had endured the same trials. Recognition was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, unavoidable, binding them across years and experiences no one else could comprehend. Maria paused for a moment, glancing around the hangar. Everyone else was absorbed in their tasks. The world was oblivious to the secret they shared. She exhaled softly, mentally counting the beats of silence between them. They didn't need to speak. That understanding was enough for now. But it came with the weight of implication. Recognition between Nightshade survivors was rarely neutral. It meant shared history, shared guilt, and perhaps shared danger. James shifted, checking another panel. He felt the faintest smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Not relief, exactly, but recognition of endurance. They had both survived when many had not. The tattoo was a reminder of all that was endured, all that was survived, and all that remained unspoken. Minutes passed in careful stillness. The world around them continued in its mundane rhythm, soldiers shouting orders, helicopters humming, crates clattering. Yet within the span of the flight line, Maria and James existed in a bubble of unspoken understanding. Nightshade had returned, not in orders or missions, but in a quiet glance and a single emblem hidden beneath fabric. Finally, Maria straightened fully, sliding the last crate into its final position. She tugged her sleeves back down, smoothing fabric over the tattoo, hiding the mark from view. James exhaled again, this time more deeply, acknowledging that the emblem had been revealed and recognized, and that no one else would ever understand the gravity of that recognition. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. They had survived, silently, separately, across years and continents. And now, standing together on the flight line, the past and present collided. No words were spoken. None were needed. Their eyes met once more, brief, loaded, and heavy with understanding. The Apache stood before them, a silent witness to the collision of history and memory. Maria's hands rested lightly on its armored frame, while James's hand hovered near the cockpit, ready to take flight, ready to move, but still tethered to the moment. Recognition was complete. Silence was understood. And in that silence, a bond was forged not of friendship, but of shared survival, of experiences too deep, too secret, and too dangerous to name aloud. The sun had fallen low over Fort Hood, stretching the flight line into long, angular shadows that twisted around helicopters, crates, and personnel. Maria Delgado moved deliberately, her arms steady as she checked the Apache systems one last time. The mechanical rhythm of her work belied the storm of thoughts inside her head. Every rotation of the rotor blades, every metallic click of the ammunition rack, reminded her that James Riley had seen the tattoo. That emblem, the mark of Nightshade, was no longer hidden. James stood a few meters away, ostensibly reviewing instruments, but his attention was riveted to her movements. The quiet ordnance loader had shifted in his perception. She was no longer just a competent soldier performing her duties. She was a survivor of missions erased from official records, a ghost from his past, manifest in flesh and ink. The recognition of that emblem had ignited memories he thought he had locked away. It had been years since he last encountered Nightshade operatives, and yet every detail of those missions returned with startling clarity. Desert winds whipping against Kevlar, The constant low hum of helicopters overhead, the secret codes exchanged. Over encrypted radios, he could hear them again as if no time had passed. And Maria was here, a living reminder that the past never truly disappeared. Her movements were careful but unhurried, almost meditative. She had mastered the art of blending efficiency with invisibility. To anyone else, she was merely another soldier on the flight line, methodically preparing the Apache for its next mission. But James could see beyond the facade. He remembered the young woman he had briefly glimpsed in Nightshade missions, her precision, her courage, her ability to remain calm in chaos. And here she was, unchanged except older, wiser, carrying memories as heavy as the crates she moved. Maria's mind drifted to those same missions. Nights spent crawling through dust-choked villages, silent and invisible under the moonlight. Operations that existed only in whispers, in encrypted channels that left no trace. She had been trained to survive, to remain unseen, to carry the emblem of Nightshade as both shield and burden. And now, on a Texas flight line, the weight of those years pressed down again. James had seen it, recognized it, and their silent acknowledgement bridged the chasm between past and present. Neither spoke immediately. Words would have been dangerous too, revealing, too loaded. Instead, they allowed the silence to stretch, to hold the weight of shared memory. Every subtle glance, every careful movement carried meaning. Recognition was unspoken, yet undeniable. In the quiet between them, the past existed again, palpable and immediate. James's mind wandered through his own recollections. He remembered the first deployment he had shared with Nightshade. Heat, dust, and uncertainty. Their mission was reconnaissance in hostile territory, officially denied by the Pentagon. They moved at night, avoided detection, and executed operations with surgical precision. Orders came with no guarantees, no backup, no acknowledgement. Success was measured only in survival. Failures were erased, as if they never happened. And every operator carried the emblem of Nightshade like a secret badge, a silent pact, and a warning. He glanced at Maria, wondering how many missions she had endured. How many nights under the desert sky had tested her in ways the world would never comprehend. How many decisions had she been forced to make that no one could ever understand? Or forgive? The tattoo was proof, but only to those who knew. And he knew. That was enough for now. Maria adjusted the straps on her gloves, feeling the fabric slide over the hidden emblem beneath her sleeve. The world around them continued in its ordinary rhythm. Soldiers shouted instructions. Engines hummed, crates clattered, but in that space, time felt different. Past and present existed simultaneously. She remembered the first time she had seen James in action during Nightshade operations, how his calm and focus under fire had both impressed and unnerved her. He had been a natural leader, decisive and precise, yet capable of empathy when the moment allowed. Their memories intertwined, unspoken but mutual. James remembered the night ambush in the Wadi Desert, how they had moved silently across hostile terrain, trusting only their training and instincts. Maria had been there, moving like a shadow, precise and unwavering. They had both survived when others had not, carrying the weight of decisions and the knowledge of what must remain hidden. That shared past was a bond neither could articulate, yet it shaped every glance, every unspoken word between them now. Maria's thoughts returned to the present. She had learned long ago that survival required adaptability, discretion, and mental fortitude. Being unnoticed on a flight line, appearing ordinary, was as much a skill as moving through a combat zone undetected. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt the pull of recognition. James knew, and that knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because he understood the gravity of her experiences. Terrifying because acknowledgement always carried risk. James exhaled quietly, feeling the weight of history pressing on him. He had spent years compartmentalizing, trying to exist in the ordinary world while carrying the extraordinary. And here she was, the living emblem of everything they had endured together, yet apart. He realized how much he had missed the presence of someone who truly understood, someone who shared the same scars. Their past, though silent, was now visible, in the emblem on her forearm and the unspoken understanding between them. The flight line seemed to shrink around them. The clang of metal, the hum of engines, the distant voices all faded into a soft backdrop. All that remained was Maria, James, and the invisible thread of shared history connecting them. The air was thick, not with heat, but with tension, anticipation, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their intertwined past. Maria finished her inspection of the Apache, sliding the last crate of rounds into place. She straightened, brushed her gloves, and turned slightly, catching James's eye. In that instant, the recognition was mutual. Neither spoke, yet volumes passed between them. She understood the weight he carried, and he understood hers. Words were unnecessary. The emblem had spoken for both of them. For James, it was a revelation and a confirmation. He had suspected, hoped even, that some operators had survived, but seeing her alive, here was a shock. He realized how much of himself he had buried, how much history had been locked away in shadows, waiting for a moment like this to resurface. Maria was living proof that survival was possible, that the past could touch the present without consuming it entirely. Maria exhaled softly, a small release of tension she hadn't realized she had been holding. The emblem beneath her sleeve was no longer hidden from the one person who could truly understand. She felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that someone recognized the truth without judgment. Apprehension because recognition always brought consequences, always carried risk, and Nightshade had never been forgiving. Sun dipped further, casting long orange streaks across the flight line. Shadows danced over helicopters and crates, painting patterns that mirrored the complex interplay of past and present. Maria adjusted her uniform, straightening sleeves to conceal the emblem once more. James nodded subtly, a quiet acknowledgement, not of familiarity in a casual sense, but of understanding and shared history. Their silence was deliberate, loaded, protective. The moment stretched, heavy and deliberate. Both understood that this recognition marked a turning point. Nightshade's past had returned, not in orders or missions, but in acknowledgement. Their connection, born in shadows and forged in survival, was now tangible. It was an invisible bond that neither could sever, a silent promise of understanding and perhaps mutual protection. Maria and James moved back into the rhythm of their duties, the flight line once again absorbing them into its normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, the recognition simmered, a quiet, unspoken force. It would influence decisions, actions, and interactions in ways neither could predict. Nightshade had left its mark, and now that mark had found resonance again in the present dot as helicopters rotated and engines whined. The pair moved with mechanical efficiency, but their minds were entangled in memory and meaning. Every glance, every step, every small movement carried significance. The past was alive, not as a threat, but as a presence that demanded acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, they both found a strange comfort, a mutual recognition that neither could ignore. The shadows lengthened and the flight line grew quieter. Maria finished securing the final crates, stepping back and taking a long breath. James followed her gaze, noting the small changes in posture, the subtle expressions, the brief moments of vulnerability hidden beneath professionalism. The world continued around them, oblivious, but they existed in a sphere defined by history, memory, and survival. In silence, they acknowledged the truth. Nightshade had forged them, marked them, and now, even years later, its influence endured. Recognition had reconnected them, bridging years of separation and experience, creating a bond invisible to anyone else, but undeniable to both. The emblem was not merely ink. It was life, survival, and a shared secret that would shape the days to come. For now, they moved apart, returning to their respective duties. But the weight of shared understanding lingered. Nightshade's shadow was present, quiet but pervasive, and neither could ignore it. In the quiet moments of routine, they carried it together, silently, knowing that the past was never truly gone, only waiting to re-emerge. Night was creeping over Fort Hood, casting the flight line into a muted palette of grays and shadows. The fading sun left streaks of orange across asphalt and metal, highlighting the rows of helicopters with a surreal, almost cinematic light. Maria Delgado moved among the machines with practiced precision, loading ammunition, and checking systems, as if she were invisible. But she knew she wasn't. James Riley's presence loomed, an unspoken pressure that made her movements more deliberate, her breathing measured, her thoughts racing beneath the calm surface. She had survived missions no one could talk about, endured operations that officially didn't exist, and walked away with her life intact. But survival came with a price. Every secret, every choice, every moment spent in Nightshade haunted her. And now, recognition had returned, not as a threat, but as a quiet reminder that some parts of her life could never remain hidden. James observed her from a few meters away, pretending to review flight data on his tablet. But his eyes kept drifting to her movements, watching her adjust gloves, check ammo, and methodically secure the Apache. That tattoo, the emblem of Nightshade, had shifted something in him, a memory he couldn't suppress. He had survived missions erased from the records, endured the same crucible she had, and yet seeing her now stirred emotions and recollections he had long buried. The silence between them was loaded, thick with understanding and unspoken questions. They both knew that acknowledgement carried consequences, even if no one else on the flight line realized it. Nightshade's legacy was dangerous. Recognition was a currency that could cost lives. And here, in the middle of an ordinary evening, they were tethered together by the past, bound by secrets that refused to die. Maria finished securing the last crate of rounds and stepped back, stretching her arms subtly. She exhaled softly, allowing herself a brief moment to acknowledge the tension she had been carrying. It was not fear of James, he would never betray her, but recognition had weight, and that weight pressed heavily on both of them. The world around them continued, soldiers moving, engines whining, helicopters rotating. No one else could sense the history threading between them, the silent acknowledgement that existed in glances and gestures. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've been through a lot," he said carefully. "More observation than accusation." His words were deliberate, testing the waters without crossing boundaries. "And I think I understand more than most would." Maria's eyes flicked toward him, evaluating, cautious. She didn't speak immediately. In Nightshade, words often betrayed more than actions. Silence had been a shield, a weapon, a lifeline. Finally, she nodded slightly. Not in agreement, not in trust, but in recognition. Her slight gesture was enough. They both understood what had been left unsaid, and for now, that was enough. The hum of the helicopters grew louder as engines spun. Up for maintenance checks. The air smelled of fuel and ozone, tangy and sharp, mixing with the sweat and heat of exertion. Maria moved to check the Apache's weapon systems, flipping switches with precise fingers. James followed her subtly, offering minimal interference, aware that his proximity was both comforting and intrusive. As they worked, memories crept into their minds, unavoidable and vivid. James remembered a Nightshade operation in a remote desert valley, where they had navigated a labyrinth of intelligence failures, enemy patrols, and environmental hazards. He recalled the tense coordination, the split-second decisions, and the reliance on each other for survival. Maria had been there, moving with stealth and discipline, a shadow among shadows, surviving the chaos with uncanny precision. Maria's mind traveled back to that same operation. She remembered lying prone beneath the desert stars, listening to encrypted radio chatter, feeling the weight of responsibility for her squadmates' lives. The emblem on her arm had been freshly etched, a reminder of what it meant to belong, to survive, and to carry the burden of actions erased from official records. And now, James stood beside her again, a living connection to that past, a reminder that some bonds could not be broken by distance or time. Their unspoken connection was interrupted by a distant sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, almost imperceptible, over the flight line's ambient noise. Maria paused, listening. James's eyes narrowed, instinct honed by years of operational experience. Neither spoke, but both understood. Even routine flight line checks could hide danger. Nightshade had trained them to read the world in subtleties, to detect threats invisible to others. The past had shaped their present vigilance, embedding instinct where ordinary awareness would fail. Maria moved to investigate, her gloved hands lightly brushing the Apache's fuselage. The tapping sound repeated, faint but deliberate. James followed, silent and cautious. Neither knew yet if it was a mechanical anomaly, a careless soldier, or something more sinister. But instinct demanded attention. Recognition of danger, like recognition of each other, was second nature. Minutes stretched into tension-filled observation. The sound came again, soft, metallic. Maria's pulse quickened, though she maintained her outward composure. James signaled, subtly with a tilt of his head, a practice gesture from their shared past, indicating they should investigate quietly. The flight line was busy, but they moved as ghosts, efficient, invisible, attuned to the potential threat. Their minds overlapped, memories guiding action. James remembered the ambush, the patrols where one wrong step could mean death. Maria recalled suppressed warnings, signals, and codes that could save or doom lives. In that silent collaboration, they operated as if the years apart had never happened, each anticipating the other's movements, each reacting with precision. The source of the sound was finally revealed. A crate had shifted under its own weight, scraping against the metal flooring. Both exhaled silently, tension easing, but not completely. The alertness remained, a residual effect of Nightshade training that never faded. Danger could emerge anywhere, even in mundane moments, and survival required perpetual vigilance. Maria returned to her duties, securing the final rounds and checking mechanical systems one last time. James remained close, observing, aware that their unspoken connection had deepened. Recognition had consequences. Shared history carried weight. And though the immediate threat was false, the underlying truth remained. They were not ordinary soldiers, and neither were the forces they had encountered before, erased from records but ever present in memory. The sun had fully set now, casting the flight line into twilight. Shadows lengthened, obscuring details, and the hum of the evening air carried a strange calm. Yet both Maria and James felt the underlying tension, the awareness that recognition could attract scrutiny, that secrets could be dangerous if exposed. Their bond, born of shared history and survival, was both protective and vulnerable. James finally spoke again, quieter, deliberate. "We need to be careful," he said. "Recognition isn't just personal. It can bring consequences." His gaze met hers, conveying understanding without elaboration. The message was clear. Nightshades past could reach into the present at any moment, and they had to navigate it with discretion. Maria nodded subtly. She understood completely. Silence had always been their ally. Trust, careful and measured, was a shield. Words could betray. Actions, however, could preserve survival. Recognition had brought them together, but it had also reminded them that their shared past was still alive, waiting for the wrong moment to disrupt the fragile normalcy they now inhabited. For a while, they moved together quietly, checking systems, observing the flight line, and maintaining vigilance. The connection between them was palpable but controlled. Every glance, every slight nod, every subtle gesture carried the weight of experience and recognition. Their past, once hidden in shadows, was now present in a careful, deliberate form. Finally, Maria stepped back from the Apache, lowering her hands and exhaling. James allowed himself a small, subtle smile. The immediate task was complete, yet the tension remained. The weight of secrets, the legacy of Nightshade, and the recognition of survival would not fade overnight. But for now, they had acknowledged it, quietly, deliberately, without words. And that was enough. The flight line was quieting for the evening. Helicopters hummed in maintenance, soldiers finished routines, and shadows deepened. Maria adjusted. Her uniform, subtly hiding the emblem beneath her sleeve once more. James watched her, understanding the gesture as one of preservation, not concealment. Recognition had occurred, but it was carefully controlled. A bond of survival maintained through shared silence and understanding. They left the flight line together. Not as friends, but as survivors recognizing each other, each step measured, each glance meaningful. The weight of the past pressed down, but it was no longer solitary. For now, they had acknowledgement, and that was a small victory in a world shaped by shadows, secrecy, and survival. The night air had cooled over Fort Hood, but the tension hovering between Maria Delgado and Captain James Riley made the evening feel charged with electricity. The flight line, illuminated by stark floodlights, cast elongated shadows over helicopters, crates, and maintenance equipment. Despite the ordinary hum of machinery and distant voices of soldiers finishing evening routines, both felt the invisible weight of recognition pressing upon them, a connection neither had expected to encounter. Today, Maria adjusted her gloves, flexing her fingers against the cold metal of the Apache's hull. Each movement was meticulous, deliberate, a subtle reminder of the precision honed during countless Nightshade missions. Even now, decades removed from those field operations, the instinct to operate silently, efficiently, and unseen remained. But James was no longer just an observer. He was an anchor to a past she had tried to leave behind, a reminder that some ghosts never vanished. James moved cautiously, his gaze sweeping the flight line in measured glances while keeping Maria in sight. The recognition of her tattoo had opened a floodgate of memories, flashes of operations erased from official records yet seared into his mind. Desert patrols, midnight ambushes, encrypted radios humming, and the constant tension of life and death. Decisions replayed with vivid clarity. And now, standing beside the same woman who had once shared those missions, the past was alive again, tangible, and pressing. The air between them was taut, every glance and movement conveying the weight of unspoken understanding. They did not need words. Their mutual recognition was enough. But survival, as Nightshade had taught them, required vigilance. Recognition could be dangerous, a spark that might ignite unwanted attention if noticed by the wrong observer. There, silence was both a shield and a tool, keeping them connected while preserving discretion. A sudden, subtle vibration traveled across the flight line floor, a distant, irregular tapping that could have been mechanical or human. Maria froze instinctively, her body moving with practiced awareness. James tensed simultaneously, scanning the shadows for potential threats. Years of Nightshade training had conditioned them to detect even the faintest sign of danger. The sound came from the west end, Maria whispered, barely audible, yet precise. James nodded, his eyes narrowing. The floodlights cast distorted shapes, hiding details in stark contrast, but the trained eye could interpret the cues others would overlook. Instinctively, they moved in tandem, silent and efficient, the rhythm of collaboration born from shared history. As they approached the source of the noise, James recalled another desert operation, where a single misstep had led to catastrophic consequences. He remembered crawling across a rocky ridge under cover of darkness, relying on the instincts of a single fellow operative to navigate a lethal environment. Maria's presence now evoked that same reliance, that same unspoken coordination. They had survived because they trusted, silently, each other's expertise. And now, decades later, they were doing it again. The tapping repeated a crate, shifted, or intentionally moved. Maria's pulse quickened subtly, though her outward composure remained flawless. James signaled with a subtle head tilt. Investigate carefully. Maintain control. They moved closer, scanning shadows, their steps calculated, barely perceptible. A figure emerged suddenly from the corner of the hangar, moving quickly and deliberately. James and Maria froze, assessing instantly. The intruder wore civilian clothing, blending poorly with the dim light, and carried a small device that emitted a faint glow. Both instinctively recognized that this was no ordinary flight line disturbance. Nightshade had trained them to detect anomalies, and this individual's presence raised every internal alarm. "Who are you?" James demanded, voice low but firm. Trained authority layered with the vigilance of a soldier who had faced countless threats in erased theaters of war. The figure hesitated, glancing between them, and James caught the subtle twitch in the shoulders, nervousness, awareness, calculation. Maria's hands moved almost imperceptibly toward the Apache's frame, prepared for rapid access if the intruder acted. Her mind raced, weighing scenarios, assessing threats. The tattoo beneath her sleeve, hidden once more, reminded her of survival, of the instincts honed in secret operations. Recognition was now active, dangerous, and immediate. The figure raised their hands slightly, stepping closer, and muttered something inaudible over the hum of distant engines. James's gaze hardened. "Speak clearly," he ordered, his voice carrying a weight forged from years of authority in secret life-or-death operations. The intruder hesitated again before pulling a small encrypted device from their pocket, pressing a button to illuminate a faint screen. The glow cast shadows across their face, revealing eyes wide with tension. "You're Delgado," the voice finally emitted, trembling with uncertainty and recognition. "And you're Riley." Maria's pulse quickened. Recognition had arrived unexpectedly, yet predictably, from someone else attuned to the past. James's jaw tightened. The situation was no longer just observation. It had become engagement. Nightshade's legacy was surfacing, and the past they had carried silently was now manifesting in someone outside their immediate circle. "You shouldn't be here," James said, his voice controlled but sharp. "Leave now, and you stay out of our path." The intruder's hands twitched, device in hand. Maria shifted subtly, ready to act if necessary. "Wait," the figure said, voice breaking slightly. I have information about Nightshade, about missions that weren't supposed to exist." James's mind sharpened instantly. Information. That word carried gravity, danger, and consequence. Nightshade's past was not just memory. It was leverage, weaponized knowledge, and often deadly. Recognition of operatives was one thing. Exposure was another. Every scenario he had considered during decades of training now condensed into a single critical decision. Maria's thoughts mirrored his caution. Exposure, even accidental, could trigger consequences long buried. including surveillance, investigations, and perhaps lethal intervention from unknown entities invested in erasing traces of Nightshade operations. And yet, the possibility of new intelligence offered potential advantage, if it could be trusted. She adjusted her stance subtly, signaling readiness without revealing intent. The intruder lowered the device slightly, as if realizing the severity of standing before two trained operatives. I've been tracking information, connecting threads, the figure stammered. There's a pattern, missions erased, anomalies, indicators of survival. James exchanged a brief glance with Maria. Recognition had turned into external pressure, and immediate action was required. The weight of secrets they had carried for decades was no longer internal. It was now external, active, and unpredictable. Their shared past had caught up to them. Maria stepped forward slightly, voice low but firm. You should leave. Now, whatever you think you know, it's dangerous. Her tone was calm, measured, yet carried the authority of someone trained to act decisively. The figure hesitated, weighing options, eyes darting between the two. James noticed the micro-expressions, the subtle tension, the flicker of indecision. Their training gave them insight. This was someone unprepared for direct confrontation, but with information that could destabilize situations if handled carelessly. Finally, the intruder stepped back, device lower but glowing faintly. I'll go, they muttered, voice trembling. But you should know. Someone else is watching. Someone aware. Someone tracking Nightshade survivors. James's eyes narrowed. Maria's pulse quickened, instincts alert. The subtle warning carried enormous implications. Recognition had turned into threat, and now survival required not just awareness, but preparation. They had carried the past silently. Now it was active, manifesting in unknown players. As the figure disappeared into the shadows, Maria exhaled quietly, recalibrating her focus. James remained tense, scanning the surrounding area with eyes honed by years of survival in operations erased from existence. Their shared past was no longer just memory. It was active, pressing against them, demanding vigilance and action. The night deepened, but neither moved immediately to relax. Every sound, every shadow, every subtle movement could signal presence, danger, or surveillance. Recognition had become a catalyst, transforming a quiet flight line into a locus of potential threat. And both understood. The weight of Nightshade's past, long carried silently, was now in motion, tangible, and relentless. They returned to the Apache together, hands on controls, minds alert. Their silent collaboration, born of history, experience, and recognition, was their shield. The emblem on Maria's arm, hidden beneath sleeves once more, was a reminder of survival and vigilance. Their connection, forged in secret operations long ago, had transformed from mutual recognition into active, shared responsibility. James finally spoke, voice low, controlled, carrying the gravity of unspoken consequence. We've been noticed. And if they're tracking Nightshade survivors, it won't stop with this one person. Maria nodded, subtle but resolute. Then we prepare, quietly, efficiently, exactly like before. They shared a brief glance, an acknowledgement of shared history, survival, and the unspoken pact that now bound them again. Nightshade had returned, not as missions or orders, but as active shadowed pressure, and recognition was only the beginning. Their past had caught up with them, and the weight of secrets now demanded action, vigilance, and mutual trust in ways they had not anticipated. The floodlights cast long shadows over the Apache, metal gleaming faintly under the dim night sky. Maria and James moved with deliberate precision, aware of every sound, every shift in the environment, every potential threat. Recognition had evolved into engagement, and survival, once solitary, was now shared. Dawn had yet to break over Fort Hood, leaving the flight line bathed in the muted blues and grays of pre-morning darkness. The helicopters sat in their rows, silent and imposing, reflecting dim floodlight in their armored frames. Maria Delgado moved deliberately between machines, her fingers grazing panels and surfaces with the same practiced efficiency as always. But this morning was different. Recognition had shifted from memory into action. Nightshade's shadow had emerged in the form of the intruder, and now the past was alive, pressing into the present. James Riley followed closely, scanning every movement on the flight line, his senses sharpened by instinct and years of operational experience. The intruder's warning had been clear. Someone was tracking Nightshade survivors. Surveillance, threats, perhaps even ambushes, nothing could be ruled out. Their quiet recognition of each other yesterday had transformed into an active awareness of danger. Maria adjusted her gloves and flexed her fingers over the Apache's controls, feeling the weight of ammunition and responsibility simultaneously. Every mission, every maneuver, every operational instinct was active. Her mind calculated potential scenarios: intruder return, surveillance, the possibility of internal compromise. Nothing was random. Everything had a pattern, and those trained in Nightshade knew to read the faintest cues. James stopped beside her, voice low. "We need a plan," he said, the quiet authority of command layered over decades of survival instincts. "We can't wait for them to make the first move." Maria nodded, eyes narrowing as she scanned the perimeter. "We prepare, quietly, efficiently, exactly like before," she replied, voice steady but imbued with urgency. Every word echoed the same unspoken understanding they had shared for decades. Survival required discipline, coordination, and absolute discretion. They began their routine with systematic precision. Each Apache was inspected, secured, and checked for anomalies, with both moving in near-silent tandem. Shadows stretched long under the dim floodlights, obscuring the smallest movements. Every crate, every panel, every rotor was a potential point of observation. Both knew the intruder's warning might not have been idle speculation. Someone else, watching, could act tonight or tomorrow. The night stretched long. Winds whispered across the flight line, rustling tarps and loose panels, a constant reminder that movement, both mechanical and human, could carry unintended signals. Maria paused by the Apache's wing, listening. A distant sound too precise to be random echoed faintly. James stiffened, signaling subtly. They moved closer together, awareness heightened. Nightshade training taught vigilance, and their instincts told them that nothing about this encounter was coincidental. James remembered a previous operation in the Afghan highlands. A single misstep by a shadowed figure had cost lives. He replayed it in his mind now, calibrating their movements, keeping Maria and himself in positions of subtle advantage. Every glance, every step, every adjustment in stance was deliberate, silent, and precise. Survival depended on preemption, on anticipating threats before they manifested. Maria caught his signal, understanding instantly. They began moving along the perimeter, checking shadows and pathways. Their footsteps were light but deliberate, eyes scanning for anything irregular. The intruder had mentioned someone else, a tracker or observer of Nightshade survivors. Recognition had become the spark, but action was now necessary. A sudden rustle near the helicopter hangars caused both to freeze. James raised a hand, signaling Maria to hold position. They waited, counting seconds as if each beat measured the difference between life and danger. The rustle repeated, a faint, calculated sound. Maria's instincts kicked in, trained over countless missions erased from records. She signaled subtly to James, observe, anticipate, engage if necessary. From the shadows, a figure emerged, cloaked in a tactical vest, face obscured by a hood. James and Maria moved seamlessly, positioning themselves with minimal visibility. The figure froze upon noticing them, hands raised slightly. Recognition flickered across the intruder's posture, indicating surprise, but also awareness. James's pulse quickened. Nightshade's legacy was not just memory. It was manifesting now, in real time, and their adversaries were trained enough to notice and calculate. "Who sent you?" James demanded, voice low but commanding, carrying authority forged in operations where life depended on compliance. The figure hesitated, eyes darting, revealing uncertainty. Maria subtly shifted her weight, hand resting lightly near a secured weapon, not to threaten, but to prepare. Every microsecond could determine the outcome. The intruder spoke, voice trembling but controlled. "Someone has been tracking Nightshade survivors. Orders came to report sightings. You are a liability. They know you exist." Maria's pulse quickened. Recognition had evolved into pursuit. The past was no longer dormant. Someone or something was actively observing, cataloging, and perhaps targeting Nightshade survivors. The implications were immediate, operational. Security was compromised, and the shadow of their past had become tangible threat. James exchanged a glance with Maria. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Their shared past, now manifest in this threat, demanded rapid assessment and strategic planning. Nightshade had survived decades of erasure, of denial, of official oblivion. Recognition had shifted into survival strategy. Their bond, unspoken yet profound, was their shield. "Leave. Now," Maria instructed, voice calm but resolute. "Whatever. Report nothing else. Return to your line of sight and disappear. If you value your life, you will obey." The intruder's hands twitched, device clutched tightly. Recognition of their authority and experience was evident. Yet a flicker of doubt passed across the figure's face. James's presence, subtle but imposing, reinforced the command. Both understood that compliance here was not merely suggestion. It was survival. Finally, the figure stepped back, device lowered, but still faintly glowing. I'll go," they muttered, but they're watching and waiting. "You're not safe." James and Maria exhaled quietly, the tension easing slightly, though vigilance remained. Nightshade's legacy, once hidden and silent, was now active, pressing into the present in unpredictable ways. The recognition they had shared yesterday was no longer passive. It had drawn attention, and attention in their world was dangerous. Maria secured the last panel on the Apache, gloves brushing over hidden tattoo beneath sleeves once more. Every movement was deliberate, careful, maintaining operational normalcy while processing the implications of the intruder's warning. James moved alongside her, scanning shadows, reading patterns, and calculating the next steps. Their shared past had become active, demanding action beyond simple recognition. The floodlights of the flight line cast long, shifting shadows over helicopters, crates, and equipment. Maria and James moved efficiently, silently, as though performing a ritual honed over decades. Their recognition had evolved from internal acknowledgement to active, deliberate coordination. Survival required vigilance, strategy, and shared understanding. And now, that understanding was being tested in real time. Dawn's faint glow began brushing the horizon, hinting at a new day, yet failing to dispel the shadows fully. James and Maria paused, exchanging a subtle glance, a quiet acknowledgement. That the past had returned, recognition had consequences, and survival required constant alertness. Their bond, forged in clandestine operations, was once again the only shield against a world that had begun to notice. James spoke quietly, low enough that only Maria could hear. "We prepare. Nightshade's past isn't quiet anymore, and recognition is never safe." Maria nodded, subtle but resolute. Then we move, carefully, together. Their footsteps echoed softly across asphalt as they retreated from the flight line toward a secure staging area. Every shadow, every sound, every potential observer was accounted for. Recognition had transformed into strategy. Nightshades. Ghosts were now in motion, and survival depended on precision, trust, and the unspoken bond linking them once more. The flight line faded behind them, but the weight of secrets, recognition, and external threat remained. Maria and James had acknowledged each other, shared their past silently, and now faced a tangible threat that demanded immediate action. Nightshade's legacy, long hidden, was active again, pressing into their lives, and recognition had become. Both shield and signal dot in the dim pre-dawn, they prepared themselves for what was coming. Shadows moved around them, threats unseen yet anticipated, and the weight of history pressed into their shoulders. Recognition had escalated, turning past survival into present urgency. And they would face it together, silently, efficiently, because Nightshade had forged them in shadows, and now those shadows demanded movement. Dawn was breaking fully over Fort Hood, a pale light washing across the flight line and revealing rows of Apache helicopters in stark clarity. The night's tension lingered like a physical weight, pressing down on Maria Delgado and Captain James Riley. The intruder's warning had transformed their quiet recognition into action. Nightshade's past had returned in the form of surveillance and external threats, and the shadows that had been dormant for decades were now alive, moving with intent. Maria adjusted her gloves, flexing her fingers over the Apache's armored frame. Every movement was deliberate, precise, trained, and disciplined. Years of Nightshade operations had taught her to react instinctively, to anticipate threats invisible to others, and to move as though invisible. Recognition of each other had initially been a shock, but now it was a weapon, a shared understanding that gave them a strategic edge. James observed her from a few steps away, scanning the perimeter. Their shared past was alive in every glance, every subtle signal. The intruder's warning lingered in their minds. Someone was tracking Nightshade survivors, and recognition had made them visible. External threat was imminent. Survival depended not just on vigilance, but on strategic action. They moved along the flight line quietly, checking shadows, listening for the slightest irregularity. The hum of helicopter engines, distant shouts of early morning personnel, and the metallic creaks of machinery formed a background against which every subtle sound became meaningful. Maria froze as a faint metallic scraping echoed from the east end of the flight line. James signaled with a tilt of his head, and they advanced cautiously. From the shadows, a group of figures emerged, moving in coordinated, deliberate steps. Tactical. Gear glinted faintly under the rising sun, and their approach was too organized to be coincidental. James and Maria recognized immediately. This was not random. Recognition of Nightshade survivors had triggered action. The threat was real, imminent, and operationally competent. James's voice was low but authoritative. "Identify yourselves," he demanded, positioning himself subtly to block the path while maintaining visual contact with Maria. His movements were deliberate, protective, and tactical, everything trained for decades. Everything Nightshade had instilled. The lead figure raised a hand, holding a small device similar to the one the intruder had carried. "We know who you are," the voice called out. Measured but sharp. "Nightshade operators, you are recognized. You must come with us." Maria's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. Her hands brushed lightly over the Apache, not in threat, but in preparation. Recognition had become confrontation. The shadows of the past were now tangible, and action was required. James exchanged a subtle glance with her, a silent plan forming. Their unspoken understanding, honed in countless missions erased from records, guided every decision. Survival demanded strategy, precision, and coordination. Recognition had turned into confrontation, and they would face it together. The lead figure advanced a step, signaling the others. "This is your only warning. Comply, and no one gets hurt." Maria's mind raced. Recognition had initially been personal, then cautionary, and now it had evolved into imminent threat. She subtly adjusted her stance, ready for rapid action. James mirrored her readiness, positioning himself to cover both approach and escape. Their shared past gave them a tactical advantage. Instinctive coordination, anticipation, and silent communication, honed over decades. Suddenly, a drone-like sounded overhead. Both froze, scanning upward. Shadows shifted as the figures reacted to the aerial presence. Recognition had escalated. They were being observed not just by ground forces, but from above. James's jaw tightened. Nightshade had trained them to read environments, anticipate movements, and act decisively. Now, every element the intruder. The group, the drone formed a network of immediate threat. Maria signaled subtly with her hand, and James understood. Split movement, quick engagement, maintaining cover. They moved with silent precision, using the Apache's shadow and nearby crates as concealment. The intruders hesitated, uncertain, momentarily uncoordinated. Recognition had provided tactical leverage. A single fluid motion, James intercepting one figure, Maria disabling a device, shifted the balance. The attackers realized they were up against operators whose experience transcended conventional training. Nightshade's legacy was alive, and Recognition had awakened instincts and skills long dormant. James pivoted, using his momentum to create a protective barrier, while Maria, precise and deliberate, moved to neutralize the nearest threat. Coordination was flawless, instinctive, a silent dance forged by decades of unspoken understanding. Recognition had transformed into action, and action into survival. The intruders regrouped, but hesitation remained. Maria and James used the moment to reposition, anticipating every movement. The rising sun cast sharp shadows, revealing subtle cues the attackers had not accounted for. Nightshade training was evident in every calculated move, every controlled breath, every observation. Recognition had become their advantage. One of the intruders lunged, but Maria's reflexes, sharpened by countless operations, anticipated the motion. A subtle, controlled maneuver disabled the assailant without lethal force. Strategic, precise, efficient. James neutralized another with similar technique. Every move was deliberate, non-lethal but effective, reflecting the lethal efficiency of Nightshade operatives without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. The group hesitated again, recalibrating. Recognition had become mutual. Maria and James recognized them as competent, trained, but not infallible. The balance of power rested on knowledge, anticipation, and precision. The attackers had recognition, but Maria and James had experience, skill, and instinct forged in decades of clandestine operations. A sudden signal, a beep from a small device, indicated external communication among the intruders. Maria's eyes flicked to the source. A drone had returned to hover, signaling coordination. James caught her glance. They moved as one, anticipating the next sequence. Recognition had evolved into full engagement. In a fluid motion, Maria and Akari. James split tactically, creating a controlled advantage. Their coordinated silence, honed instincts, and shared past allowed them to manipulate the environment. The intruders advanced cautiously, unaware of the depth of training, recognition, and experience confronting them. The standoff reached its peak. One misstep by the attackers, one precise maneuver by Maria and James, and the balance tipped. Recognition, anticipation, and instinct converged. A subtle movement by Maria caused the lead figure to stumble slightly, triggering a chain reaction of hesitation among the others. James exploited the moment, using leverage and precision to control the immediate threat. The attackers, realizing the skill, coordination, and experience they faced, hesitated further. Recognition of their adversaries' capabilities shifted, their posture from aggression to caution. Maria and James, silent but resolute, maintained control. The shadows of the past had collided with the present, and survival demanded mastery. Finally, the attackers retreated, devices left behind, communication broken, and movement halting as they vanished into the periphery. Recognition had transformed, confrontation into control, and the threat, though real, had been neutralized without unnecessary violence. Maria exhaled, adjusting her gloves, while James scanned the perimeter one last time. The flight line returned to quiet, the rising sun washing over the helicopters in muted light. Recognition had evolved from a silent, personal understanding into active survival, and the past had proven both dangerous and empowering. Maria and James, bonded by shared experience and instinct, had navigated the collision of shadows with precision, skill, and resilience. James finally spoke, voice low but carrying calm authority. "Recognition has consequences," he said, eyes meeting hers, "but it's also what keeps us alive." Maria nodded subtly, her pulse still elevated but controlled. "We survive together," she replied. Recognition had led to danger, confrontation, and action, but also to reaffirmation of their bond, skill, and instinct. Nightshade's legacy had returned, but so had their control over it. They moved back to the Apaches, securing equipment and preparing for the day ahead. Recognition had changed everything, but the training, experience, and shared understanding allowed them to navigate the aftermath. Shadows of the past lingered, but now they were active allies rather than threats, reminders of survival, skill, and connection forged in the crucible of Nightshade missions. As sunlight spread across the flight line, Maria and James shared a brief glance, silent acknowledgement. Recognition transformed from hazard into strength. The past had returned, recognition had escalated, threats had collided, and survival had prevailed. Nightshade's legacy endured, alive in memory, skill, and action. And for Maria Delgado and James Riley, recognition had become more than observation. It had become their lifeline, their bond, and their path forward.